My name is Dana Roberts, and the night my dad decided I still belonged at the kids' table was the night I finally snapped. He'd invited everyone to this fancy family dinner at a vineyard restaurant, the kind of place where the menus don't have prices and the servers pour wine like they're handling liquid gold. He kept saying how proud he was to have all his grown kids together. And for a second, I let myself believe I was included in that. Then the host pulled out my chair. Not at the long, polished table set with real glassware and cloth napkins where my parents sat, where my married brother and sister settled in next to their spouses. No, my chair was at a tiny round table shoved off to the side, already cluttered with crayons, paper cups, and kids' menus. A booster seat on one chair, a plastic cup with a lid and a bent straw on another. Dana, you can sit over there with the little ones, my dad said, like it was obvious. You're so good with them. Help keep them busy so the adults can talk. The adults. My chest went tight. I was in a dress I'd bought after 2 extra shifts at work. I'd driven an hour straight from the city. I paid my own rent, my own bills. And somehow in his mind, I was still the built-in babysitter. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just pulled my hand back from the kids' table, picked up my bag, and walked out of that private room without a word. Hours later, while the wine kept flowing and the plates kept coming, someone finally realized I was gone. And that's when the panic started. Before I tell you what happened next and how far my family went to drag me back into my place, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Stepping back from that night, my mind keeps drifting to the patterns that shaped me long before I ever walked into that vineyard. Growing up in the Roberts household came with an unspoken rule book, one I didn't write, but somehow was expected to obey, without question. It was clear from very early on that our family had a strict hierarchy, and my place in it had been decided long before I understood what it meant. My dad, Henry Roberts, liked structure the same way he liked his wine collection, organized, curated, and displayed in neat rows that never changed. He treated family roles the same way. Stephen, the oldest, fell perfectly into the mold of the responsible son, the one who maintained the legacy Dad loved to brag about. Denise slid right into the role of the polished daughter who did everything at the right time and in the right way. Both of them earned nods of approval simply by fitting the picture he wanted to present to the world. And then there was me. I wasn't rebellious or dramatic growing up. I was just different. I liked my independence, my space, my own choices. But in a family that prized predictability and tradition, difference wasn't neutral. It was a flaw to be monitored. I didn't notice it right away. It began subtly, like being brushed aside in conversations, or having my accomplishments labeled cute instead of impressive. Every milestone that mattered to me seemed to earn a smaller reaction than even the most ordinary updates from my siblings. Dad had a way of making his judgments sound like harmless observations. Each time he commented on my lack of stability, it felt less like concern and more like a reminder that I hadn't hit the life markers he valued: marriage, kids, a house in the suburbs. I had chosen a different pace, but that choice seemed to erase my adulthood in his eyes. Even as I built a career and managed my life on my own, he kept viewing me through a lens he refused to adjust. Mom, Patricia, rarely pushed back. She operated in a kind of emotional quietness that made everything seem smaller than it actually was. Whenever I tried to express frustration, she would gently redirect the conversation, as if acknowledging my feelings too directly might disrupt the fragile balance she depended on. That quietness didn't soften anything. It only carved deeper spaces for my resentment to settle. With Stephen and Denise, the divide wasn't intentional, but it was always present. They had families, responsibilities, routines. Their lives fit the narrative Dad cherished, and because of that, they rarely questioned his behavior. They didn't notice how often I was minimized because they weren't paying attention to the places where I was quietly pushed aside. They were busy maintaining their own versions of perfection, unaware that those standards were being used as a measuring stick against me. The more I think about it, the more I see how each small moment built into something larger. There were holidays where I was the default babysitter, gatherings where I was talked over, and decisions made without me because it didn't really affect me. It was as though my adulthood came with an asterisk, recognized only when convenient, dismissed whenever hierarchy mattered. I began carrying myself differently because of it. My confidence grew outside the family, in my job and friendships, but shrank whenever I stepped back into the Roberts orbit. I learned to anticipate comments before they were said, to hold back opinions that might be dismissed, and to shrink just enough to keep the peace. That shrinking became instinctive, a survival tactic I didn't question until much later. Looking back, it's clear that none of this was sudden. It wasn't about one dinner or one remark. It was a long, silent accumulation of being treated as an accessory to the family rather than a full member of it. I can see now how much I internalized, how many times I tried to rationalize behavior that left me feeling unseen. The weight of that history didn't just sit on my shoulders, it shaped the way I walked through every family event. And somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I started preparing for the moment I would no longer carry that weight the same way. Not intentionally, not with a plan, but with a quiet, growing awareness that I didn't want to keep repeating the same cycles. I didn't want to keep shrinking to fit a role I never chose. That realization didn't come with anger at first. It came with clarity, a slow understanding of who I had been taught to be and who I actually was when I stepped outside their expectations. Stepping into the present again, I can still feel the weight of that room pressing against me long after I walked out. The memory unfolds with a sharpness that hasn't dulled, as if the air itself carried the judgment that floated between every polished surface in that private dining space. The evening had barely settled into its rhythm when the subtle divide between their world and mine became impossible to ignore. The first course arrived with a kind of ceremony that seemed designed to impress. Plates landed at the long table with precise movements, almost choreographed. I could sense the energy around Dad as he watched everything unfold the way he wanted, as though each detail reflected directly on him. It was strange observing it from where I sat, a few steps removed, yet close enough to feel the message behind every choice he made. Nothing had been arranged by accident. The conversations around the main table grew livelier as the wine flowed. Laughter rose and fell in predictable waves, all centered on topics that highlighted their proximity to adulthood as Dad defined it. Mortgage renewal, planned renovations, school registrations, each one reinforcing a structure I was excluded from. Even without acknowledging me directly, they built a wall that required no material to stand. What caught my attention, more than the topics themselves, was how effortlessly they aligned with Dad's expectations. Stephen's confident posture as he listened, Denise's composed nods as she chimed in. They filled the roles assigned to them so naturally that I wondered if they even realized how tightly they were holding those positions. It was a play they had rehearsed for years, and the winery setting only raised the stakes. The server's return marked the beginning of a shift I didn't anticipate. Another round of dishes arrived, rich aromas and careful plating making it clear these were meant for the people Dad considered the adults. The contrast hit me when I looked at the small table near me, a tray of simple food placed without ceremony, as if the distinction didn't require explanation. It wasn't the meal itself that stung, it was the clarity of the message behind it. The separation was intentional, unmistakable, and so casually delivered that it nearly felt normal. My internal reactions moved faster than I could manage, a tightening across my chest, a pulse of embarrassment, and a quiet, rising anger that came not from the food, but from everything it represented. Years of subtle dismissal felt like they had condensed into a single moment. Each assumption about who I was and where I belonged pressed against me with renewed force. I couldn't escape the feeling that my presence had been shaped around convenience rather than inclusion. A small commotion broke out near the kids, their restless movements escalating as the evening dragged on. The noise drew a look from Dad, one that carried the expectation I had grown used to. It was a silent command, an unspoken reminder of where he believed my responsibilities lay. I didn't need him to say anything. I had lived under that type of direction long enough to recognize it instantly. My thoughts sharpened around the realization that nothing I had done to build my own life mattered here. Independence, stability, personal growth. None of it altered the role they insisted on assigning me. The gap between who I was outside that room and who they allowed me to be inside it grew so wide I felt it physically. The decision to stand didn't come with dramatic buildup. It wasn't a burst of rebellion or a grand moment of defiance. It was a quiet acknowledgement of a truth I could no longer ignore. I rose without hesitation, guided more by clarity than emotion. The room carried on without noticing at first, which only confirmed how invisible I had become in their carefully curated arrangement. Walking toward the door, I felt a shift inside me, subtle but irreversible. Leaving the table wasn't about rejecting the food or the company. It was about stepping out of a role that had constrained me for too long. I didn't need anyone to stop me or question my actions. I didn't even look back to see if they reacted. For the first time that evening, I moved entirely on my own terms, and that single step away from the table felt like the beginning of something I didn't yet have a name for. Stepping into the cool night felt like crossing an invisible threshold, one I had hovered near for years without fully approaching. The air outside held a quietness that didn't exist inside that polished dining room, and the sudden contrast struck me with a mix of relief and heaviness. My footsteps carried a clarity I hadn't expected, each one pushing me further from the weight of expectations that had pressed against me since the moment the evening began. The parking lot was dimly lit. Rows of cars lined up in neat order, yet nothing about the setting felt rigid the way the dinner had. I moved with an urgency that came not from fear, but from a force that had been building inside me long before tonight. Unlocking my car felt symbolic, as if the small mechanical click announced a boundary I no longer intended to cross again. I slid into the driver's seat with a sharp breath, not quite steady but grounded enough to turn the key without second-guessing myself. The drive began without destination, guided more by instinct than planning. The winery faded behind me, replaced by stretches of quiet road broken only by headlights passing in the opposite direction. With every mile, the tension knotted in my chest began to loosen, though it didn't disappear. It simply shifted, settling into the space where realization tends to form. I wasn't escaping, not in the way someone might flee a situation impulsively. I was stepping into a moment I had avoided acknowledging for years. My mind replayed the earlier scenes in fragmented details, not to dwell on them, but to understand the deeper currents beneath them. The small table, the assumptions, the silent expectations. They weren't isolated incidents. They were expressions of a structure that had remained unchanged for so long I had mistakenly believed I had to adapt to it rather than question it. The drive offered a rare stillness, a chance to confront that truth without interference or noise. The longer I remained on the road, the more the night felt like a blank slate stretched out before me. The absence of immediate pressure allowed my thoughts to settle into sharper lines. I recognized how often I had adjusted myself to keep the peace, even when the cost was a quiet erosion of my own identity. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was a steady unraveling of familiar patterns that no longer held the weight they used to. A small diner appeared along the side of the highway, its glowing sign cutting through the darkness. The sight of it drew me in, not for comfort, but for space. The kind of neutral ground where no expectations followed and no roles waited to be stepped into. Pulling into the parking lot, I felt an unexpected steadiness settle over me. It was the kind of calm that comes not from certainty, but from the freedom of not needing permission to choose differently. Inside the diner, the muted hum of activity created a buffer from the thoughts swirling in my mind. I slid into a booth and let the quiet rhythm of the place steady me. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, not in preparation for anything, but simply to exist without negotiating my presence. The simplicity of the setting made the earlier string of events feel both distant and sharply defined. My phone remained face down on the table, a deliberate choice. I knew messages were piling up, calls, questions, assumptions, and attempts to pull me back into the structure I had just stepped out of. The silence between me and that device felt like a boundary I wasn't ready to cross yet. I didn't want explanations or pressure. I needed the space to sit with my own thoughts before letting anyone else's voices in. As I waited for my food, the weight of my decision settled into a clearer shape. Leaving the dinner wasn't a temporary reaction. It was a line drawn after years of ignoring the quiet pull toward autonomy. This moment in the diner wasn't about retreat. It was about reclaiming the kind of presence I had never been allowed to hold within my own family. The distance I created tonight wasn't an accident. It was a necessary step toward redefining where I stood and who I intended to be. When the plate finally arrived, I focused on the simple act of eating, grounding myself in the present without rushing toward conclusions. The night outside continued on, and for the first time, I felt it move with me rather than against me. Whatever came next, I knew this was the first moment in a long time that truly belonged to me. A quiet stillness settled over me as I sat in that booth. Yet the moment didn't stay calm for long. The first vibration on the table broke through the calm like a sharp tap on glass, pulling my attention to the phone I'd tried so hard to distance myself from. I didn't reach for it right away. Instead, I watched the screen light up with the familiar glow of incoming messages, each alert carrying a sense of urgency I wasn't ready to confront. The second vibration followed almost immediately, then a third, and soon the phone buzzed in uneven intervals, forming a rhythm that clashed with the quiet atmosphere around me. I felt my heartbeat pick up despite my attempt to stay grounded. I knew what awaited me on that screen. Concern wrapped in expectation, questions wrapped in pressure, and a tone that would insist their worry justified everything that had led me here tonight. When I finally turned the phone over, the screen was filled with notifications from every direction of my family circle. Group chat messages stacked over missed calls, each one revealing how quickly the situation had shifted from dismissal to panic. The speed of their reaction struck me with a mix of irony and heaviness. Moments earlier, I had been invisible at that table. Now my absence had become an emergency. Seeing Dad's name among the alerts stirred something complicated inside me. His messages appeared first, time-stamped one after another. I didn't need to read them yet to understand the tone. He had always defaulted to the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. Even through a phone, I knew his words would carry the same weight. The insistence that I explain myself, the expectation that I return, and the underlying certainty that whatever decision I had made was unnecessary. Mom's name showed up with a longer thread of messages, likely filled with softer phrasing that masked deeper pressure. Her version of urgency rarely came from anger. It came from the fear of disruption, from a belief that harmony mattered more than acknowledgement. I could already imagine the emotional appeal woven through her texts, each one pulling at a thread she thought would lead me back. Stephen and Denise appeared next, their messages shorter but sent in rapid succession. Despite our differences, they had always responded quickly in moments like these, not out of malice, but out of habit. They had grown accustomed to stepping into the roles expected of them, even when those roles meant reinforcing a structure that kept me on the outer edge. As I scrolled through the notifications without opening any of them, A strange clarity settled over me. Their urgency wasn't about my well-being. It was about the disruption my absence created. The moment I stepped out of line, the entire structure shifted, and they were scrambling to restore it. The pattern was familiar, but this time I wasn't reacting to it with guilt. I was observing it with a distance that made everything sharper. Another vibration broke the moment, and this time I watched the new notification appear in real time. It came from the group chat, a rapid stream of messages flowing in as though they were trying to fill the space I created by leaving. The words on the preview hinted at concern mixed with frustration, the kind of tension that tended to escalate when I didn't respond quickly enough. Holding the phone in my hand, I felt a tension tug at me, a pull toward old habits. The instinct to explain myself was still there, buried beneath layers of frustration and hurt. But letting that instinct lead again felt like stepping back into a pattern I had just begun breaking. I set the phone down before it could influence me further, choosing the silence between us over the noise trying to reach me. Sitting there, I began to examine the emotions rising within me. The pressure wasn't coming from their messages alone. It came from the years of internalized expectation that made me feel responsible for maintaining balance, even when that balance demanded I shrink myself. The conflict inside me wasn't about whether I should answer them. It was about recognizing that silence didn't make me irresponsible. It made me honest. The diner's quiet atmosphere shielded me from the urgency on the screen. The muted conversations around me created a buffer that allowed me to reclaim a sense of autonomy. Here, I wasn't being measured or assigned a role. I was just a person sitting in a booth, deciding what to allow into my space. Letting the phone rest face down again felt like reclaiming a small but powerful boundary. The messages could wait. The pressure could wait. For the first time, I gave myself permission to pause without feeling obligated to fix anyone else's discomfort. The space I held in that moment wasn't about defiance. It was about choosing myself with a quiet certainty that had taken years to build. The phone continued to vibrate occasionally, but each alert grew easier to ignore as I leaned into the stillness unfolding around me. There was a moment sitting in that booth with the muted lighting around me, when the silence began to feel heavier than the noise I had escaped from. It settled slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if waiting for me to acknowledge something I had avoided for far too long. The phone lay on the table between my hands, no longer vibrating as frequently, yet carrying the weight of every expectation that had been placed on me over the years. I could feel the shift inside myself long before I picked it up again. When I finally turned the screen toward me, the flood of unread notifications didn't shock me the way it had earlier. The intensity had dulled into something quieter, something that felt less like an urgent pull and more like a reminder of the imbalance I had grown accustomed to. My eyes moved across the most recent alerts, taking in the steady stream of messages without opening any of them. Even at a glance, I could sense the tone behind each one, concern tangled with frustration, confusion laced with the assumption that I would eventually fall back into line. My thoughts moved slower this time, steadier, shaped by a clarity that had been forming ever since I stepped out of that dining room. I realized I wasn't avoiding them out of spite. I was creating a pause, a space to breathe, to consider, to choose, intentionally instead of reacting. The very idea of responding felt like walking across a fragile bridge, one that could easily lead me back into the patterns I was trying to break. Yet remaining silent forever carried its own weight. I shifted the phone into my hands and let myself consider what a response would mean. Not an apology, not an explanation shaped to minimize their discomfort, but something that represented the truth I had finally allowed myself to acknowledge. I wasn't trying to fix the evening. I wasn't trying to mend the image they held of me. I was choosing a moment to assert boundaries that had never been recognized before. My fingers hovered over the screen, not yet typing, simply absorbing the reality that this was the first time I would address them without cushioning my words. There was a strange calm in that awareness. The version of me who usually folded under pressure wasn't the one holding the phone now. The person sitting in this booth was someone who had walked away from a lifelong pattern, someone who had chosen her own presence over obligation. I began shaping the message slowly, not writing anything yet, but forming the framework in my mind. I wanted to express the distance I needed without justifying it. I wanted to acknowledge my hurt without diminishing it. The message wasn't meant to provoke or accuse, it was meant to provide clarity. Something I had lacked in that room, something I had lacked in that family dynamic for years. As I organized my thoughts, I felt the tension that had followed me through the evening begin to settle. The act of choosing my words intentionally brought a sense of grounding I hadn't expected. It allowed me to see how often I had softened myself to maintain a peace that never belonged to me. This message, however, wouldn't be shaped by those old habits. It would come from a place I had learned to claim only recently, a place of self-respect. When I finally began typing, the words flowed with a quiet steadiness. I didn't write about the table or the seating or the food. Those details didn't define the deeper issues. Instead, I focused on the patterns, the consistent dismissal, the assumptions about my role, the way my adulthood had been treated as optional. I wrote about the distance I needed, not as punishment, but as preservation. I addressed Dad without circling around his authority, Mom without cushioning her avoidance, Stephen and Denise without hiding the imbalance between us. The message wasn't long or dramatic. It was clear, direct, and steady, an outline of boundaries that had never been allowed to exist before. When I finished typing, I read it once silently, not to soften it, but to ensure it reflected the truth I had spent so long minimizing. With a slow breath, I pressed send. The phone rested in my hands for a moment afterward, the weight of it somehow lighter than before. There was no rush of regret or anxiety, just a growing sense of certainty. Whatever responses came next, whether confusion, frustration, or silence, I knew this was the first time I had spoken from a place that belonged entirely to me. And in that quiet booth, with the night still stretching on outside, I felt a shift settle into place. Not an ending, not a resolution, just the steady beginning of a boundary finally spoken aloud. There was a strange quiet that settled over me once the message had been sent, a quiet that didn't feel empty but intentional, as if the air itself was giving me permission to sit with the weight of everything I had just put into words. I didn't know how they would respond, and for the first time, the uncertainty didn't feel threatening. It felt necessary. The boundaries I had drawn weren't tentative or fragile. They were the clearest truth I had spoken in years. The phone sat on the table again, no longer a source of dread or noise, but simply an object that waited for whatever would come next. I watched it without reaching for it, letting the silence stretch long enough for me to feel the shift taking place inside myself. There was no rush anymore, no urgency to manage their reactions, no instinct to soften the edges of my feelings so they could be easier to absorb. In the stillness of that moment, something finally aligned within me. A recognition that stepping away from the familiar wasn't an act of abandonment, it was an act of self-preservation. For so long, I had convinced myself that staying quiet meant keeping the peace. But that peace had never included me. It had always depended on my compliance, my silence, my willingness to accept a smaller place at a table I was told I should be grateful to sit near. A new notification lit up the screen, but I let it dim on its own. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I didn't need to read the responses to understand the emotions behind them. Shock, confusion, maybe even frustration. They would try to fit my message into the framework that had always made sense to them. They would try to interpret it through the lens of family unity as they defined it. But none of that changed the reality of what I needed. As the night stretched on, I allowed myself to reflect not on their assumptions, but on my own patterns. Every memory that surfaced had a clarity I hadn't been able to access before. I could see how often I had ignored my own discomfort to maintain an image of stability that only benefited them. I remembered moments when my voice had been minimized, when my feelings had been brushed aside, when my independence had been treated as immaturity. None of those memories were dramatic on their own, but together they formed the foundation of the distance I felt now. What surprised me most was the sense of relief that came with acknowledging those truths without trying to reshape them. I wasn't rewriting history. I was finally allowing myself to see it without the filters I had used to justify their behavior. That clarity didn't erase the hurt, but it helped me understand it with a depth that felt grounding rather than overwhelming. Eventually, I picked up the phone, not to read anything, but to turn it off completely. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was steady, like a deep breath after years of shallow ones. I realized then that choosing distance didn't mean choosing loneliness. It meant choosing honesty. It meant choosing a version of myself that didn't bend under the weight of expectations I never agreed to carry. When I stepped outside the diner, the night air met me with a calmness I hadn't felt in a long time. The parking lot was still, the world moving at a pace that didn't demand anything from me. I walked to my car with a sense of certainty I hadn't expected to feel so soon. The road ahead wasn't symbolic. It was simply mine. As I drove home, the landscape around me blurred into the kind of quiet that made room for reflection. I didn't need to know what their next steps would be. I didn't need to anticipate their explanations or discomfort. Whatever shifts would come next were no longer mine to manage. I had made my place clear. I had drawn a line they could no longer step over without acknowledging the boundaries I had finally claimed. By the time I reached my apartment, a new understanding had settled into me, one shaped not by anger, but by acceptance. I wasn't stepping away from them to punish anyone. I was stepping toward a version of myself that had waited patiently for years to be recognized. And if there was anything this night had taught me, it was this. Respect is not earned through proximity or obligation. It is earned through recognition of someone's autonomy, adulthood, and dignity. For the first time, I finally recognized my own, and I wasn't willing to give it up again.